killing fields. It's a fascinating book. Usually movies don't do judgment to a book, as I'm sure you know, but actually the movie follows the book fairly accurately, and it is a horrifying but very revealing account of one episode of what the attempt to build a communist utopia led to in terms of a terrible human tragedy. I might also mention that there's a very good movie about the Soviet Union period, particularly under Stalin in the 1930s and 40s. It's called The Inner Circle, and it too is based upon a true story. It's based upon the young KGB officer, secret police officer, who showed movies for Stalin in the Kremlin. He was the projectionist. That was his job. And it followed, and he wrote a book about it. And this movie was made, obviously slightly fictionalized for dramatic effect. They always do that. But basically, it's the account of this this projectionist and how here he is part of, a staff member on the secret police working in the Kremlin around Stalin all the time, and how it ended up ruining and destroying him and his life. There's very little violence. There's virtually no violence in the movie. But my wife, and particularly other older Russians that I've spoken to, who are old enough to have lived through those Stalin years, say that there is no other movie that they've ever seen that captures the psychology and the atmosphere of the era of Stalin in the Soviet Union better than this movie. It's called The Inner Circle. I don't know if it's out on DVD. I know that it was released on VHS tape. It's an American-made movie. If you've ever seen a movie about the composer Mozart called Amadeus, it stars the same actor, Tom Hulce, as this young projectionist. And it has both American, British, and Russian actors. It was filmed in the Kremlin, which was after the end of the Soviet Union, and is an excellent portrayal of the psychological atmosphere of the totalitarian state under Stalin. Okay, so but this is the human cost of building utopia. This is the human cost of building utopia, because the communists and the socialists believe that the entire old society had to be done away with, from top to bottom, and that included doing away with the human garbage which stands in the way of building a new world, a better world, a socialist world. Now, when you think about numbers this big, 64 million, 80 million, 25 million, it's very difficult to get your handle around that. But just remember that each one of these 64 and 80 and 25 million people, each one of them, 2 million, each one of them was an individual human being. A man, a woman, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, an uncle, a niece, a nephew, an aunt, all of whom had their dreams, their hopes, their wishes, their desires, and whose lives were snuffed out because a government considered them to be dangerous or undesirable in the new and better world that that government was determined to create. Now, the fact is that not only was these brutal regimes that controlled everything, they also were failed regimes. One of the things that is indicative as to also why socialism was both a failure and dangerous is that we talked earlier about people having freedom of information. When the government owns all the means of production, owns all the land, all the factories, all the enterprises, is the only employer, then the only thing you know, the only thing you're allowed to see, hear, or watch, the only information you are allowed to have is what the government chooses to give you. If the government owns all the land and has to allocate it for the good of the society, then what if you want to build a building in which you are going to practice your faith? Well, if the government decides not to allocate the land, if the government decides not to allocate the resources, the construction material to build the church, the synagogue, the mosque, guess what? You don't get it. You want freedom of information? Well, if the government owns all the newspapers, all the radio stations, all the television networks, then guess what? You only get to see what the government wants you to read, see, and hear. And if the government doesn't want to import movies or allow books and newspapers and magazines to come in, well, it's the one government monopoly distribution system of all forms of information. The more the government controls, the more the government owns, the more it determines what the options, opportunities, and information will be that the people have. When the government owns everything, there's only one employer in town. You know, in the Soviet Union, you would have not just an external passport, like to leave the Soviet Union on a trip, you had to have an internal passport. And this internal passport had every bit of information in it. Your name, your parents' name, your date of birth, your nationality, your class position, and it followed your work history. And it recorded whether your supervisors in any government job you ever held thought you had been loyal, good, and obedient follower of the Communist Party. They dictated where you worked. They dictated where you lived. They dictated what access you had to food, clinics, any amenities and necessities. My wife, I told you, is Russian. Her apartment was given to her by the state. She couldn't live any other place. She was told what city to live in, what neighborhood to live in, what apartment building to live in, what apartment to live in. And if the state wouldn't approve you moving, even to a different apartment, you didn't. And if you applied for one, you had to wait till the government decided it was going to give you a new place to live. And that was stamped in your internal passport, your propiska, as it was called in Russian, your residency permit. And if you were found outside of the city in which you had been formally permitted to reside for more than 3 days and you had not reported to the police, you were subject to arrest and possible imprisonment. Nothing was left outside of the control of the state. There is no freedom in that situation. It was a total controlled society. Everything was watched. For example, I was traveling there. Okay, I was traveling there on this consulting business I told you about. Well, you know, my future wife was having a gathering at her apartment one evening. I will confess I perhaps had a drink or two. Since I was staying at a hotel on the other side of Moscow, I had a rental car. I decided that it would be better not to drive, and I was just going to, sleep on the couch in her apartment. So I get up the next morning, get into the car, drive across Moscow to my hotel. It's called the Cosmos Hotel. And now I park the car and I go up to my floor. Now, on every floor of the hotel, at the elevators, was a desk behind which sat a hotel matron, sort of watching everybody's comings and going. And so I get out of the elevator, I just sort of nod a smile at her, I don't say a word. I'm about to turn to go down the corridor, and she says to me, "It has been noticed that you didn't sleep in your room last night." What? How would they not know that I didn't sleep in my room last? Well, of course, you see. They were keeping track that the car had not come into the underground parking lot. They had kept a record of the hotel matron at that floor during her shift, who had showed up and what room they were in. And they said, she says, where were you? Well, I'm not going to tell her I was sleeping at, my then girlfriend's apartment. So I said, oh yeah, I was driving around in the countryside and out in the forest outside Moscow. It was getting dark and I was getting tired. I thought it'd be safer to just pull over and sleep in the car overnight rather than drive, since I was so tired, dark roads and stuff. Next time you plan to sleep in forest, be sure to tell us. This is before cell phones, right? Tell you? We take for